which is to reflect on the outcome of COP28 and also to think about where we need to go from here till next COP. My name is Manish Srivastava. I am Associate Director at Earth Science and Climate Change Division. We had a very positive response to this event. There are more than 80 people who have registered. So some have joined online. It's simultaneously being live telecasted on YouTube as well. So those who are listening to these proceedings through YouTube, very warm welcome and good morning to you all as well. We have a very interesting panel, an experienced panel. So I'm sure next 2 hours are going to be a treat and a lot of food for thought would emerge. I won't stand between the audience and the panelists and immediately request Dr. Bibha Dhawan, Director General, TERI, to give her opening remarks. Dr. Dhawan.
Thank you so much, Manish, and very, very hearty welcome on a cold winter morning to TERI. Well, I really speaking when I'm sitting amongst experts like all of you, I hardly have to say anything about what was discussed in COP and what COP was. Of course, I'm a new entrant to this field. I'm basically an agricultural biotechnologist, but attending COP for the 3rd year, what I felt was that it's a big networking opportunity that it provides us. And especially this COP, when we had more than 100,000 participants, one thing I found which is emerging in a very positive direction is the standard of discussions which were outside the negotiation room. That was very encouraging because while walking, you sit down anywhere and whatever forum they are discussing, it was serious discussions on a particular topic. And then it is that everyone have started talking about the climate change. So even a primary student also knows that climate change is something which is going to impact us and we must try to curb it. We are talking like when we talk about the outcomes of, there are so many institutions who have brought out publications on outcomes of COPs, which are quite interesting. One thing which I personally feel, and maybe I'm totally wrong, is that we go to COP, we talk about various negotiations, and which perhaps is more towards at international level, what is happening. How do we, in a way, those negotiations should not harm us in any way as a country and so on. We are still not talking about what action must be taken, whether by support from international donors or by ourselves. So that particular thing, I think somewhere the action, what do we expect between this COP and next COP in terms of action is not discussed to that detail. But maybe, because as I said that I'm really not the expert and therefore you can contribute to that much more. So I'm looking forward to very fruitful discussion today and welcoming you once again to TERI. And I'm sure it won't be just this particular meeting. We'll continue discussing with you, learning from each other and ensuring that India, which is going to be one of the worst affected countries due to the changing climate, we should be able to take action as soon as possible and save ourselves. It's not saving anyone but ourselves from the ugly face of climate change. So thank you once again and welcome.
Thank you, Dr. Dhawan, for your encouraging words. Now we move to our first panel discussion, which is to deep dive into what went into COP28 negotiations and what it may mean for Indian economy, as well as India's foreign policy on matters relating to climate change. We have a very experience-rich panel here. Ms. Rajarshi Ray, who is an economic advisor at Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change. It's almost 3 decades for her, ma'am.
Less than 2 decades.
I have been seeing you always with Mr. Rashmi and Dr. Ghosh, so I assume, and sometimes company transfers next week. And so is Dr. Ritu Mathur, who is right now with Niti Aayog, but for a long time with us, and was very instrumental in doing the technical analysis of the core questions relating to mitigation and ambition, what is in India's interest and what is not. So their expertise, we will hear from them. But this panel is being moderated by Mr. R.R. Rashmi, who is, I think, a mentor and guide to almost everybody present in this room on the issues relating to climate change. So this is going to be over to you, Patty.
Thank you, Manish. Thank you for your kind words. And once again, a very good morning to all of you. It's quite timely that we are meeting after having seen what has happened in Dubai. It's important to take stock of the progress that we have made and what lies in store for us. Now, if you look at the range of issues that were discussed in Dubai, what were the key issues on which we have made progress and where we have not made progress? I think that's we need to understand. Dubai was unique or rather exceptional in the way that they brought loss and damage upfront. This was a decision to be taken. Everyone was expecting that this decision will be taken on the loss and damage. But towards the end, after a lot of wrangling and protracted negotiations, so somehow Dubai was clever in bringing it up front. And I think a lot of backroom negotiations have happened before. And the reason why a loss and damage issue was clinched in a way, because of 2 reasons, all of you know that, Dubai pledged a substantial amount of money, which is unlike the Global South. Sure. Dubai being a part of Global South, it was not expected to do that, but it pledged a substantial amount of resources to loss and damage, and I think that broke the impasse. Whether it bodes well for everyone, I'm not sure, but certainly as far as the loss and damage issue was concerned, this initiative by Dubai helped take the process forward, and a part of the deal, of course, is that the facility will be housed in World Bank, which was a way of placating the developed countries. They didn't want to be seen this facility and this mechanism to be too much as a separate independent process like the Green Climate Fund. So this was good in a way because this has brought the large number of small island developing countries and small vulnerable countries on board. But there is one important issue there because the fact that the facility has now been created and it has been capitalized, the issue of vulnerability is still open. Who all will be covered by the loss and damage fund is not known. The definition of vulnerability is extremely sensitive, although it is largely understood that most of these funds will be made available to smaller countries. But technically and on principle, it cannot be said that the larger countries should be denied this facility. So that remains a core issue of how to define vulnerability in the years to come. The contribution issue aside, I think on the contribution issue, also some developments are taking place I heard a lot about the attribution studies. The countries which are affected, the countries which are causing climate change, they should be made to contribute. And that can be done only through an attribution model exercise. So a number of scientific studies are being suggested that the countries which are responsible for climate change, and obviously when you look at responsibility, it is the picture is very hazy. So the entire Paris Agreement is based on the current emissions, the current responsibilities. The historical responsibilities have been given a second, rather relegated to the background. So in that scenario, the responsibility will obviously fall on large economies, all large economies. So this again is a tricky issue. Both vulnerability and responsibility will become an important issue as far as loss and damage is concerned. The second important issue, which I think emerged from the COP, was that it was essentially a GST COP, and therefore a long-term plan for implementation of the targets had to be found. This plan is not there, but certainly you can see some of the key conclusions there. The GST process has said that we should move away from transition, make a transition away from fossil fuel. The renewable energy targets have been tripled. The energy efficiency targets have been doubled. In a way, that GST indicates that the country should make a progress in this direction. These are the pointers. How this will be done is not known. How this will be internalized in the NDC process is also left to the countries concerned, because it's not necessary that each country will use each one of these pledges as part of its NDC. That will depend on the national circumstances. But nonetheless, the pointers are clear that now in the next cycle of NDCs, which is going to begin from 2025, most of the important countries, larger economies particularly, will be under pressure to look at these specific pledges and specific targets and somehow accommodate them as part of their national targets. The third important issue was, of course, this was something positive which happened at Dubai. I must commend the presidency that finally they concluded the work on adaptation, the global goal on adaptation. This is something which has been pending for a very, very long time. At least a framework has been adopted, because adaptation issue has always remained secondary in global discourse. So at least for the first time, they have started a definite about setting targets for adaptation at the national level. Globally, they have set a framework which includes specific sectors, 5 or 6 sectors. I think they have clearly identified. And it was a pleasant surprise that health is also part of that. And health was not there earlier. Agriculture, water, other ecosystems, but health is also a part of that. In fact, health is not a part of our national action plan as yet. There is no mission on health. I don't know whether they have.
It has come now. 9th mission.
So initially it was not there. So in a way, globally also they have recognized that these are important sectors and there should be targets. So there is a target setting exercise which has been mandated under the global goal on adaptation for each country to come up by 2025, and they have to start implementing by 2030. They have to come up with a report also on that. So in a way, that is one very positive development, I must say. But the most critical question is still unresolved, is that of resources. All this implementation of the pledges on the GST side, on the work program, on the mitigation, adaptation, resources are still undefined. There is a large figures that have been quoted are about $4 trillion for energy transition, about $6 trillion for net zero transition. But in terms of actual resources, there is no money available in the global system. So the implication is that each of the large economies is expected to find its own resources. And in India, we have been, this has been happening actually. So far, all our indices have been implemented with largely our domestic resources. And this is likely to be trend in the future as well. So where do we actually land? That is something on which we will have to work. If we have to find our own resources to implement the targets and also contribute to the global goal, what kind of mobilization we can have. Globally, they are looking at private capital, and they are requesting the multilateral development institutions to bring in this private capital as part of this system. Obviously, this has its own costs, and it will not happen without costs. Somebody has to bear that cost. Its indications are clear, unclear. So here, I think the Rajshri may have something to say on this. But the critical question is that apart from what is happening at the global level, we will have to find resources domestically for this kind of transition, both in the long term and also in the short term. And what are the key pointers there we will need to understand. So I'll stop here, and I'll request the panelists who are here with us to go deeper into these issues and see what lies in store for us. So Rajshri and Ritu Mathur, we have these two panelists here, and we have about 25 minutes or 30 minutes. So, and then there are people waiting on the virtually connected with us. So maybe they will have some questions to us. So let me request Rajshri first that looking at the conclusions that we have got in Dubai and this serious challenge of mobilization of resources, what do you think is likely to happen? And how do you look at these conclusions in Dubai?
Thank you, sir. And thank you very much for this opportunity. Yes, I attended COP28 from day one to the end of the session. So it was definitely a big COP, and primarily because of the reason that it was the first global stock taking, and various world leaders, in our case, in the World Leaders Summit, Honorable Prime Minister attended, and he was the kind of keynote speaker. So before commencing the technical negotiations and all, focus of late, recently we see in various COPs that in addition to the technical agendas and all, there is a lot of initiatives, declaration, pledges, and also we were also kind of asked to look into various initiatives, various pledges and all. And there was, I would be honest in saying, there was a lot of pressure from different quarters to look it into in a very positive way. And a few of them we joined. But if many of the declarations and pledges, we did not join because of the kind of implications it will have on the various sectors of the economy. There was something on health. We looked at it on the face of it, the language. For any layman, it would be kind of very great idea and all. But then between the lines, there were languages which kind of implicate our supply chains and all. So those issues were there. There was something on agriculture. There was something on cooling, which we looked at it, but then we could not because of those implications and all. But now coming to the technical agenda, I will go by the order in which sir indicated loss and damage, then global stock take, and we do have that GTA session thereafter. Perhaps I will not touch the global goal on adaptation now. So let me start with loss and damage. Loss and damage was allotted to me for negotiations at COP28. And so we went with a lot of preparations for the loss and damage. And on the first day, it is a kind of departure. And honestly, we did have a lot of concerns with the governing instrument, which was kind of recommended from the transitional committee to the COP for consideration. And we did have, as Mr. Sir already indicated, how the resources are defined. If we compare the loss and damage governing instrument with the GCF governing instrument, which we adopted it in 2011, There is one paragraph in the GCF which talks about financial inputs, and there it is very clear that developed countries shall provide resources, and the language is very, of course, there is another line that the financial inputs can come from other sources, including philanthropy and all, but then there is a clear sentence there that developed countries shall provide. But if we look at the loss and damage, that the shall obligation or that clear cut, that thing is not there in the loss and damage. But then it is a very important fund, and it is very close to the hearts of the small island developing states and other LDCs. And I mean, even to look at, and COP consensus means that you really look into that delicate balance and all. So we really wanted, but then the point is that with all those kind of considerations, and we need to look at the global south as a whole, how they are taking it forward and all. So the first day itself, and as Sir said, that COP28 presidency very smart, played it very smartly on the first day of the COP itself. They adopted the decision, and everybody supported. And we saw that within 20 minutes of the announcement, there are many pledges. So now it is a different story altogether. The pledges can come, whether that is translated into contribution agreements and all in 1 year time, 2 year time, that would be a different story. But the board will be constituted. We have also put our claim for the membership of the board of the loss and damage fund within the Asia Pacific. We'll have to see whether we are getting it and all, but we have put our claim for that. So the board will have a lot of work to do regarding the policies, disbursement and all. So as far as the eligibility criteria is concerned, as per the governing instrument, yes, developing countries, including the large developing countries, can access resources from the loss and damage fund. So eligibility criteria, it is fine. But as far as the resources, the only one concern which we had is the financial inputs, who would provide the resources. That is not very clear. So when, of course, it is true that 700 million plus pledges we have received and all. But going forward, in order for the sustenance of the fund, how it was, of course, board will have to play a very, very important role. So that was about the loss and damage fund. So this would remain a very big concern going forward, as far as the, if means with all kind of fanfare, if you set up a fund and if that is not replenished and all, so that is something which we have to kind of work very hard and fight very hard to get it. So that was done on the first day. So my half of the work was completed. So after making the statement, minister turned to me. I was sitting behind and he said, Rajshri, ek dukan to band ho gaya tumhara.
Came in with a plan or a strategy, you know, first day, putting the money on the table.
They did work very hard. As Sir said,
Everybody's, you know, whatever thoughts people came with for the negotiation.
they worked very hard behind the scenes on the previous day, bilaterally. So that way they were very smart. Yes. So that is about the loss and damage fund. So there are concerns, as I said, there especially on the financial inputs and all. Now, second is about the global stocktake. Of course, I was not handling the global stocktake. I have some kind of broad points. When it comes to GGA, I handle GGA, so I will be able to explain it in a much more detailed way. So GST, yes, it was the first GST. And there are a number of, and once that decision was adopted, it had a lot of, it kind of received a lot of media attention compared to GGA. GGA perhaps did not get that kind of attention the way GST decision. So GST, it was just after the adoption. From various media reports, it was hailed very historic. Whether it is really very historic, of course, time will tell how historic it was. But then for the first time, it did talk about transitioning away from fossil fuels, of course, with some caveats, just orderly and equitable manner. And And again, there also, of course, there is a recognition of the developed countries providing resources. The word is recognition and kind of things. So that again, that shall obligation, definitely it is not coming. So there is, one would say that there is no explicit mentioning of the developed countries taking the lead. That is something which definitely all the developing countries would have wanted as far as the means of implementation is concerned. And a lot of talk about paragraph 28 of the GST decision. Of course, it does mention about a nationally determined manner. The people will take, means the countries will take the actions in a nationally determined manner. And of course, it has that CBDR, all those language is there. But at the same time, that important that wording regarding the resources, again, yeah, one would say that it is there, but we would have kind of wanted it in much stronger language. And it talks about, of course, tripling renewable energy, doubling energy efficiency, and transitioning away from fossil fuels in the energy systems in a just, equitable, and orderly manner. But all these are at global levels. So countries will take action in a nationally determined manner. And it does talk about submission of an NDC. It states that 10 to 9 to 10, I think it's clearly 10 months before CMA, 10 months before CMA 7, which means it is November 2025. Then if you do the back calculation, 10 months before that means literally we have 1 year, 1 year for giving us, for giving the next NDC. So for which, ma'am, you said it in the opening address that of course the international decisions are taken, what we do it domestically, and I just want to kind of brief, after the COP, we already had our meeting of the Apex Committee for Implementation of Paris Agreement, which is an interministerial committee, and it's kind of action lies with various economic sectors and various ministries and all. So for that coordinated action, so the ministries concerned, departments concerned have been sensitized about the outcomes which is the from COP28 and action which we have to. So that process has already. I just want to mention about that.
So India, that way we are proactive. Let's take it. No, we are compared to most other countries, or even if we compare the way we are working versus global, we are ahead of them.
And with regard to finance, I would like to say, of course, COP28 was, it's more of GST, and of course, in the first week, it was the people were hailing about the loss and damage fund decision, then of the GST, of course, certain talk about GGA. Finance decisions in COP28, I would say it was only an intermediate decisions. Perhaps we can call next COP29 as a finance kind of COP, because there will be a decision which would be coming on the new collective quantified goal. So whatever decisions we had at COP28 on finance, more or less like a kind of intermediate decision. And even from the GST, what we see is that a lot of the next processes involves a lot of dialogues and all, then how we kind of participated in that dialogue to further flesh out that modalities and all, that would be very important. And there is something very specific coming on the multilateral development banks. Of course, that is something which is again one can see that some kind of synergies from the New Delhi G20 New Delhi Declaration, so MDB reforms and kind of things, that is also there in the finance decision. And one positive development, very important, is that in the GST decision there is some mention about unilateral measures. That was found mentioned in the international cooperation section of the GST, which of course it did not mention specifically about Article 3.5 of the convention, which talks about the unilateral measures, but the language implicitly means that it is about 3.5 and means opposing that unilateral measure, that language. There is a kind of background to it, because South Africa wanted an agenda item to be introduced. Of course, agenda was not adopted, but then that had some impact in the discussions in the GST. So regarding NDCs, it talks about 9 to 12 months in advance of CMA 7. So CMA 7 will be in November. So 9 to 12, so literally very. And another important point which we need to see is that though we don't agree on gas specific, or for that matter sectoral approaches and all, in some ways, methane has been mentioned. So specifically, that there is a mention about that, and there is a mention about the transport sector. So various sectors in the GST decision, it is there. So it's a reality. We need to kind of now work progressively on going forward. We need to work on that. And it talks about zero and low emission vehicles. All those kind of points have been indicated. So as far as action is concerned, as I said, that will means those preparations, especially NDC preparation, that is something which, and there is some dialogues about climate and children, mountain, expert dialogue on mountain and climate. So all those things have been kind of introduced into the GST decision. And there is also mention about the long-term strategies, revising the long-term strategies. So long-term strategy, and we do have a net zero target by 2070. So that is something, even if there's a decision talks about it, but then it is a nationally determined manner we embrace. So that is something we have just submitted our long-term strategy. So I'm not saying that formally, but personally, what I feel is the long-term strategy which we have submitted will have its life for many years to come. So that would be our long-term strategy. Then GGA, I would come later, but then just wanted to mention about there were some wordings like transformational adaptation, incremental adaptation and all, which of course there is no specific definition. And also the challenge here is that for when we write the projects and all, how we kind of define these terms and all. So writing a project for accessing resources and all, that would be a bit of a challenge, but then that is something which we really need to kind of work. And broadly important sectors have been mentioned in the GGA, agriculture, food, health, all these sectors have been, and 2-year work program, sectors have been mentioned, targets have been mentioned, timelines have been mentioned. Now, in the 2-year work program, we have to develop the indicators. So, and we have been given an opportunity by March 2024. We have to give some submissions about our views about the development of those indicators, so that we would be preparing. Of course, there is a lot we have to look into the SDGs here when we talk about the indicators, when we develop those indicators, how we really need to map the progress of those SDGs, and accordingly we'll have to prepare those. But the point is that one good positive thing is that there is a lot of focus on strengthening adaptation action. Might not have been the case maybe 10 years back or something. So there is a lot of progress, but there is a lot of work also, especially in development of the indicators. One important thing which is not there in the GGA text now, because we managed to get it deleted and all, there was a lot of talk about systems like health systems, agriculture systems, though that wordings are not there in the GTA text as of now. But in the initial draft, still the 2 days before, perhaps on 10th of December, those things got off the table. The systems, so agriculture, food resilient systems. So when we talk from an adaptation perspective and all, yes, fine. But the moment you talk about systems, then that supply chain implications are there and all. So it indirectly talks about a mitigation of agriculture sector or food sector, health. And when we talk about health systems, it does talk about the cold chain, cooling, coolants, all. So we could get it removed, that word systems, it in totality, which includes both mitigation and adaptation. So those things we got it deleted. There was a lot of talk about 2.1.c linking it with the adaptation goal. That we should get it dropped from the GGA text. Of course, a few things like, as I said, that maladaptation, transformational adaptation, and those things. But we could live with it in the last moments of the give and take. We could live with that. And there were much more stronger language in various paras about the means of implementation in the GGA. But finally what was adopted, of course it is there, means of implementation is there, but perhaps not as strong as what we ordered. So it's a very honest explanation of what exactly has happened behind the scenes. So of course, that is how the negotiations take place. Maybe I'll come back later. Thank you. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rajshri, for an excellent view of what has happened in Dubai in various areas, and particularly the fact that the challenge of NDC 2025, which is to be the first draft has to be ready by the end of this year or maybe early next year. That will be a major challenge, and that will have to take into account what has been said in the GST. So that's obviously a key issue. And finance, you have said that it is still an intermediate, it's still a work in progress. Next COP also is not likely to resolve this.
Baku will be that.
2025, I think the current targets, the current timeline for the existing $100 billion expires in 2025. So only I think around that time they will take a call, or maybe they get delayed. One doesn't know, because this is a very sensitive issue. And thanks for pointing out the implications of the way the language has appeared in the adaptation text. That's extremely, the insights which you have given are extremely important. That while the targets and the timelines are required to be followed, we also need to understand the implication of some of the processes that have been indicated there. So thank you very much. Let me now go to Ritu, and from her rich experience in the work of the energy transition, how you look at the GST, the kind of the targets or the way forward that has been suggested there. Plus, there is a work program on mitigation also already in progress. So, connected with this, looking at the larger range of issues, and the fact that we have to come up with a new NDC, at least the first draft. How do you see this process?
Thank you so much, sir, and thankful for being invited to this very important workshop. Whatever I'll be saying is more in my personal capacity here and limited to more of the global stock take. So I think how I see it is, we did not have too much of an expectation from this year's COP, but I think it did make some headway in terms of moving forward and sort of bringing in different kinds of stakeholders into the game, a little more push across numerous items which were like spelled out by Rajeshri also, like health, agriculture, etc., all becoming part of the larger conversations. But I see a sense of some traction in the right direction coming out as a result of the overall COP. In terms of the language, again, in terms of transitioning away from fossil fuels, I think it's a mixed bag as I would see it. In some way, it has taken a little bit of pressure away from singling out coal when it comes to Indian context. But at the same time, at the global context, it gives people more room to also continue with gas and other transition fuels. So again, a point that Rajeshri made, I think everything going forward now, how we translate it in terms of our own country contexts, relates with the challenges that we face within our countries. So in the next year, I think the larger requirements will be to internalize these challenges and think about these challenges. And I think the boundaries of climate finance or the economics of the transition, etc., vis-a-vis the technological moves that we are likely to see, these are getting extremely blurred. I think economics is at the center of nearly everything. So if we are looking at move towards net zero, or we are looking at the long-term strategy or the updation of the NDCs, it really is would need to consider what we can do in terms of and how we should position ourselves as a country in terms of the elements of trade. And Rajeshri mentioned again the supply chains. I think it becomes extremely important to look at the critical mineral side and what we will be able to do with regard to enhancing our ties internationally. Again, with regard to the link with the economic side, I think the connect with regard to how do you increase the value add in the economy. We do have aspirations of a certain level of growth. We have the twin challenge of meeting our ambitions towards a 5 trillion economy or a developed country status going ahead. So again, in looking at how we look at updating our NDCs, these will become more and more central to doing the analysis, which so far has remained more a technology-driven analysis to a technology and economics-driven analysis. Also, in terms of we talk about carbon markets, etc. The CCTS is again something which we are looking at the national levels. But chalking out what should be the kind of activities which we keep in the domain of the CCTS vis-a-vis what we keep for the international market. I think that's again something which will become important in terms of being able to delineate as we go ahead in looking at how India chooses to sort of map out its way forward. I think the points on health, agriculture, etc., that again have been brought in, I see them as important elements from the development perspective. So again, when we are looking at the national context and looking at moving ahead, each of these elements need to be woven into and mapped into our development needs, our need for resilience. And again, I think when I'm talking of lines being blurred, the lines are also getting blurred between the mitigation and the adaptation sides. So there is going to be, and there is already, some impact because of climate change on various sectors. Are we able to delineate that and look at apportioning that element to saying that we require resources for looking at addressing this vis-a-vis what is it that different sectors need to do in terms of aligning in terms of the economic growth, and how can the value add from each of these sectors again align with the growth story of the economy. So I think, again, the work at the national level is needing to be seen in a very different avatar, as I would call it. So during the time of the earlier NDC preparation, we looked at sectors, we looked at what we could do in the energy sector, in the forestry sector, and so on, and charted out some trajectories. But this time around, I think we would need to look at many more connects other than those siloed sectoral connects, and the need to look at deeper dives, but at the same time more interconnected dives when we are taking any of these decisions, because the repercussions on the economic, environmental, energy, etc. sides are extremely complex and important to address simultaneously when we think about how to go forward. Again, the point that one brought up in terms of the supply and the value chains, thinking about taxonomies, I think again is going to be an important issue. Rajeshri mentioned some concerns on health and the linkages. But similarly, when we come to energy, how should we determine the taxonomies of various clean or green fuels, green infrastructure will become very important to be able to manage both our own requirements in the transition and the linkages with trade and being connected to the global markets. So the growth and energy challenge is not simply restricted to that, but also linked to multiple dimensions as we are going forward. And this, again, needs to be something that needs to be taken cognizance of. In terms of actors, again, I think the COP was able to bring together the understanding and in terms of increasing the awareness across a variety of stakeholders. That again must continue. And I think when we are talking about private investments, where much of our need will necessarily remain focused, while we may talk about the MDBs, while we may talk of international plans needing to come on the table, I think willy-nilly we will have to bank on private sector getting up to have more funding. So what are the roles that they can play? How is it that policy can play to further those kind of interactions is again something which needs to be worked at in the coming year to see that we turn our policies into and incentive structures into ways that are able to garner more and more of the private finance as well. So largely, I think at this point in time, my sense is that economics is becoming very, very central as a need to all our thinking around how we need to chart out our way forward. And from a NITI perspective, again, I think thinking about our local challenges, thinking about our local issues, and thinking about things from the bottom up is becoming more important. NITI again is looking more at state level understanding and looking at working through the gram panchayats and the district level analysis to understand and help people map out what are the kind of opportunities that are available on ground at the local levels and how best can we use those opportunities. So I think that is again something which is going to be very important in being able to understand correctly, make use of those opportunities correctly, and tie those in with our growth story, tie those in with our SDGs, tie those in with our long-term perspective and our climate considerations, whether it is on the mitigation side or the adaptation side. So I think I'll stop with that for now, and maybe we can come back at another point. But I think that is how I see where we stand at this point.
Thank you, Ritu. With these extremely valuable remarks by the two panelists, we have come to the end of the first session, and I don't intend to take any further time because the second panel is waiting and we have already exhausted our time budget. But just to cap what the two members of my panel have said, thank you, Ritu, for pointing out this intersectoral linkages and the economic cost of the transition that which we have to deal with in the future. Yes, I mean, we will, you said that in the next NDC, perhaps we will have to take this into account as to how this entire cost is reflected. And then we make a conscious choice accordingly about this transition. You have talked about the involvement of the private sector as well. What are the instruments which we can deploy to attract them and minimize the economic costs while involving them in the process of growth. So thank you very much, and thank you, Rajshri, for pointing out the key areas of decisions, the challenges which lie ahead. You have talked of some of them. For example, the unilateral trade measures, the supply chain issues which involve the across the sector, and the economic implications of adaptation and mitigation, convergence of these two things. And one point which we have, of course, not touched, and I hope the next panel will take it up, the global peaking. They have talked of global peaking by 2025, although, of course, it's aspirational. We are already there, perhaps in 2025, and we are nowhere there. But it's very important indication that I saw a presentation in Dubai where they have talked about the developed countries, large number of developed countries now taking up. The curve is bending now. As far as their emissions, the total emissions are taken concerned, there is now, they have almost reaching the plateau there. So which means they will be in a politically strong position to put up equal amount of pressure on the rest of the world. So that is a challenge which we have to face, and I don't know how we are going to cope with that. So once again, I thank both of the panelists and look forward to an interesting discussion in the second panel. Thank you, Manish. Over to you.
Thank you, sir. Also, Rajeshi and Ritu for very insightful presentations. I think they raised some important questions that the researchers should focus on now and almost urgently, I would say. So one of the issues that I think in one way or other kept coming in the presentations also is the future of global goal on adaptation, how that would be actually implemented. There are still technical questions open when it comes to implementing it in different national contexts. So the next panel focuses exclusively on that space. We have a very, again, very experienced, rich panel. We have Harjit, who has been following negotiations for, again, more than 2 decades now, I think. Yeah, Shashikant ji we have here, who looks at the technical aspects of social and environmental transitions, very important intersectionality. We have Mr. Arun Krishnan. He looks at the question of financing in climate action. And we have Suruchi Badwal, who leads work on the scientific underpinnings of all these discussions when it comes to adaptation. How does different vulnerabilities work? How do we determine or choose between good adaptation, bad adaptation, maladaptation, and a lot more? And to moderate this panel, we have Dr. Pradeep Ghosh. He is one person that we, whenever there is a new issue comes up, we always look up to him. And again, I can say now, since he joined late, I perhaps would not have said that earlier about Mr. Rashmi, but now I can, same thing I can say that he is the person that which has been a mentor and guide to almost everybody present in this room. So over to you, Dominic.
Thank you, Manish. Well, we have a very challenging task before us. Discuss the global goal on adaptation and the way forward for COP29. Now, of course, the dialogue on climate change has been dominated by mitigation for many years. And the first time that adaptation, that developing countries for whom adaptation is critical, they attempted to bring the adaptation as a central focus of climate change negotiations was in the Delhi COP in 2001, of the Delhi Declaration. But even then, and despite adaptation having also been becoming a part of the Paris Agreement, adaptation has somewhat remained the stepchild or a prodigal son of the global climate change move. Now, there are many reasons for this. I wouldn't like to attribute any motives on part of any countries or groups as to why this strong focus on adaptation. But let me put it this way, that adaptation is a much more complex animal to deal with than mitigation. For example, in mitigation, we can talk of goals in terms of one or two indicators. We can talk of either absolute global reductions of greenhouse gases, say percentage reduction, 50% by 2030 or whatever, and 100% reduction by 2050. That's the net zero goal, which is very accurately, can be accurately measured, accurately stated as a goal. Of course, there are huge equity issues involved in how to translate this into commitments of individual countries, but that's a separate issue. Or alternatively, for mitigation, one can speak in terms of the probabilities of reaching 0.0 or 1.5 degrees centigrade rise in global average temperature. Once again, the science is fairly well settled. We know what is the, given up to a certain emissions trajectory, what it will translate into the global average mean temperature rise in terms of well-defined probabilities. The case of adaptation, however, is much more complex. First of all, there are multiple themes. And of course, some of these themes have been identified in COP28. But I'll come to the themes. I mean, that the point is that these do not lend themselves easily to single indicators, single quantitative targets. The science, I will not say it is not settled, but it is much more complex. How do you deal with the macrobiological impacts on an ecosystem are much more complex to derive than the science behind emissions and the resulting lower temperature rise. So it is much more complex to define and to conceive of the different goals. Now, several themes have been identified in terms of which the GGA is to proceed forward. And here we have water, food, health, ecosystems, infrastructure, and poverty reduction, and cultural heritage. Yeah. Each of these is a complex animal in itself. So, for example, if we take water, what are we talking about? Are we talking about droughts, floods, about water security, about water pollution? It is a very complex, complex thing to deal with. Similarly, if we are talking about, say, poverty eradication, now how do you measure poverty? That itself is a very complex social science by itself. So one nettle has been grasped, and that is that these 5 or 6 themes have been identified as themes that will be addressed in the But what about the yardsticks? What about quantitative or qualitative goals? And each of these is, again, as I mentioned, can be conceived of in multiple dimensions. They're very, very hard, difficult questions, and besides, science is very complex. Now, when we talk of global goals and adaptation, we also have to bear in mind the linkage between the global goal on adaptation and the global goal on mitigation. What precisely do these goals on adaptation, how do they translate into, how does 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees, what are the implications in terms of the global goal on adaptation? And again, these are, because the global goals and adaptation cannot be something which is completely divorced from the global goal on mitigation. Now, there are a number of other themes. Finance is, of course, a huge theme in terms of adaptation. Of course, in respect of adaptation, there would have to be much greater reliance on public funding, on public finance. In terms of mitigation, there are many more opportunities for public finance or private finance to come in. The corporate sector can find profitable opportunities for addressing mitigation. But not that the opportunities are not there, but the opportunities are much fewer, much more focused on a few sectors like, for example, water conservation or flood protection and so on. To some extent, maybe ecosystem services. But overall, the scope for private sector funding is much less. Secondly, that because of the great complexity of arriving at different goals in terms of the different themes, there is corresponding uncertainty with respect to the quantum of finance required. The quantum of finance required is much more easily computed in the case of mitigation. Then, of course, the big equity question, some countries bear the prime responsibility for causing the problem in the first place. But other countries are the ones who will actually suffer the impacts the most. What is the linkage in terms of responsibility for causing climate change and the responsibility for providing means of implementation? And this is another nettle that will have to be grasped. Of course, this is not separable from the corresponding responsibility in respect of the mitigation. So now let me turn the floor over to our very distinguished panelists. And I first give the floor to Mr. Harjeet Singh. He has already been introduced, so I don't need to further introduce him. So Mr. Harjeet Singh, you have the floor. Can I request the speakers to limit themselves to about 5 minutes so that we have time left over for comments and questions from the participants. So Mr. Harjeet Singh, you have the floor.
Sure. Thank you very much, Dr. Ghosh. And pleasure to be in this room talking about COP28 and the way forward. So we have already covered a lot of ground, and let me try and build on what Rajshri also mentioned. There is no doubt, and as Mr. Rashmi alluded to earlier, that adaptation, I've been calling it a poor cousin. Yeah, so a step, a kind of step treatment that adaptation got. But I think it's also important to recognize how the issue grew, because when we were drafting convention way back in 1990s, we were confident that through mitigation, we'll be able to deal with the crisis. And that's why adaptation was mentioned barely 4 to 6 times in different formulations. even developing countries were a lot more confident that we should focus a lot more on mitigation. And as you said, over the years, when impact started increasing, we realized that we have to focus on adaptation, and adaptation is not a free pass for mitigation. It became, the other side of the coin. If we had allowed rich countries to go their way, we would not have even seen adaptation in Paris Agreement. We knew that. The earlier drafts were only about mitigation, not even finance, not even adaptation. And I'll come to politics in a bit. But before that, let's talk about global goal adaptation. So Africa brought it up in 2013 as part of its submission, where it specifically asked for this goal and with quantitative targets supported by ILAC, so the Latin American nations, but they were more looking for qualitative targets. And you are absolutely right, Dr. Ghosh, it's fairly complex. So complexity is one reason why we don't have quantitative targets, but there's also politics behind it. So eventually we got it in Paris Agreement, but no progress was made because the agenda was full. There's a lot happening in terms of Paris rule book. Eventually it was picked up again in 2021. And thankfully we got the GGA, the Global Goal Adaptation, agreed. Now, you've already mentioned about those 6 sectors, so I'll not go deep into that. But I think the important aspect, if you look at the previous drafts, there was a mention of specific targets in terms of at least by 2030, what we can achieve in terms of water security, or how much changes we can bring in terms of agriculture resilience, or even poverty eradication linking with SDGs. So there was an opportunity to make them a lot more concrete, but all those numbers have been dropped, and now a 2-year process has been agreed to work on those indicators, and there's going to be more opportunity to go deep into that. But there's another set of target that's there immediately after that section, which is about iterative adaptation cycle, which I think is very concrete and really gives us a North Star, a sense of direction where we need to go to, where it talks about how we need to do the impact assessments, including risk and vulnerability assessments by 2030. And the planning has to be completed by all countries by that time. And so that becomes the basis for us to move forward. And it also includes a target for having a multi-hazard early warning system in all countries by 2027. So that's also very specific. And that really can be a base in terms of giving opportunity to each and every country to develop their own impact assessment than something which is driven or dictated by the international process. And adaptation in any case is a lot more rooted and grounded and has to be more bottom-up than targets being set in boardrooms or in the international processes. And this is going to be an important one. Now, what we actually missed when it comes to politics or the support part that has been briefly mentioned, one, of course, there's no mention of equity and CBDR. I mean, there's reference to equity, but in a very different context, more at the local level. But common but differentiated responsibility has not been mentioned while developing countries were pushing for it. Extremely weak language on finance. It refers to doubling. Again, the earlier draft did not even mention the adaptation gap report, which talks about a massive number of $215 to $387 billion annually needed over the next few years. Eventually, the number landed in the final GST decision, but no plan on how this money is going to be mobilized. And that is a major gap. Doubling of adaptation finance by 2025, again, there's no roadmap. We keep saying that Standing Committee on Finance is going to work on it, but there is no clear plan. And if that doesn't happen, then developing countries will not be able to do it. And some of the other things that we were pushing for was a standing agenda item on adaptation, especially understanding that it developed, as you said, over the last few years. So there is no consolidated way. It's very fragmented. How we look at this agenda, again, that is going to be discussed this year, and then it's going to be finalized next year. So overall, the issue is not getting as much attention as mitigation. And I think that's where it's important to understand why it is happening. When large number of countries, developing countries, are demanding why it is not getting traction, because rich countries don't want that. As I said, in 2015, when we were negotiating for Paris Agreement, rich countries were not interested. They are interested in mitigation because that's for their own interest as well. You know, if emissions continue to rise in developing countries, and the reality is that 67% of emissions now come from the developing world, they are worried about it. And they are more concerned about mitigation because that affects them. But if adaptation doesn't happen in developing countries, it doesn't affect them directly. Of course, there are repercussions in terms of, migration and many other issues, but overall it doesn't hit them directly. But I think that is gradually changing when now they are seeing so many impacts hitting them hard. The other reason why they are not interested, because then they are held accountable to provide finance. And adaptation finance is measurable. As you very rightly said, Dr. Ghosh, private sector is not interested. It's only 2% of finance on adaptation that's coming from the private sector right now, because private sector is all about making money. Adaptation is about helping people, climate proofing their homes and livelihoods. So private sector is not able to make money, and that's why it's largely public finance. And because it's public finance, developed countries are not interested, because it's grant and you can measure it and you can put pressure on it. So that's the reason it has not made progress. And I think that's where we need to really call rich countries out on why they have to provide support, and much more emphasis has to be there. And I think next 2 years, while it sounds like a technical process, but it's going to be quite important for us also to unpack some of those targets. And for us, as India, which is also highly vulnerable and is always ranked as one of the top 5 or top 10 countries in terms of vulnerability. I don't want to get into a lot of data because of lack of time, but I think it's important for us to have district level plans and state level plans on adaptation. And some of these international processes provide us an opportunity to learn from and then connect our own processes with that international system, so that we can learn and also contribute. And it's in our interest to develop adaptation plans because we are also facing these disasters, and there are numerous numbers how we are going to lose 3.5% of our GDP over the next few years, and so many new poor people are going to be added to, because I have met so many people who had a piece of land, said, this is a piece of paper I have to that land which is now submerged. So, which means that climate change is creating new set of poor people. So, and adaptation is something that can actually help in some ways, and then of course connection with loss and damage. Let me stop here because of lack of time, but I can come in later. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Harjeet Singh, for this very wide-ranging toward the horizon on the adaptation themes in the COP. And I now give the floor to Mr. Arun Krishnan, though Mr. listed number 2. Since you're seated in this order, we'll proceed in this order.
Thank you, Dr. Ghosh. And it's good to be here among this expert committee to give a brief about. I want to focus about the financing aspect of it, and not so much about the negotiations and so on, because I know more about financing than about the negotiations. So, as many speakers mentioned, the financing pathway is not very clear. Climate Policy Initiative, we have done a study. We do a study annually for the landscape of climate finance. And the latest 2021-22 report shows that only 63 billion out of 1.27 trillion in climate financing is going purely to adaptation, right? So the rest are either with mitigation or with mixed use. And the corpus of adaptation fund is only $1.1 billion. And India, if you see, NABARD is the implementing agency for adaptation fund, and it has around 850 crores worth of projects, right? So goes on to show that this is grossly inadequate. Financing has to increase. As speakers mentioned before, the estimates for adaptation financing needs is, it's a wide estimate, but it's from 150 to 350 or more $billion per annum by 2030. Now, of course, there has been some mention in the GGA about increasing adaptation funding, but even doubling of adaptation funding is not going to be enough. There is also a focus on specific sectors, like, for example, water, AFOLO, and so on. But can we expand the number of sectors which we are considering, and also look at the additionality of what would otherwise not be adaptation projects? Let's say the ceiling which opened in Bombay recently, you add an additional element of adaptability there, and therefore, that additionality is strictly audited, will also come under the adaptation financing part, right? So grey infrastructure, India is going to build out a lot of grey infrastructure and a lot of, buildings and so on. So can we actually find a means to measure that and include it in adaptation? And also, of course, while we do have adaptation funding channel through NABARD in India, can we set up a specific adaptation fund and scale it up? Now, there are three problems in accessing finance. It can be, I mean, from an adaptation perspective, but more broadly from a climate perspective as well. One is the mediation by government agencies, like for example, I specifically mentioned NABARD for adaptation. So NABARD's focus is of course on agriculture, and more often than not, you see these projects being Apollo related projects. I mean, it's not by, it's not because they want to only focus on Apollo, but it's where their expertise is. So this mediation creates some problems in some sectors accessing this finance. The second is, of course, long lead times, right? Everybody knows how much time it takes, for example, from GCF to get a project up and running. It takes 18 months at the minimum. And the third is lack of customization, right? So there are, now adaptation, you have to look at it from a broad perspective, but also from the ground up, right? So one example is the cool roof policy of Telangana government. It's a very retail finance kind of policy when you think about it, because an individual will decide whether they want to make their roofs cool or not, right? So then there has to be retail financing for those individuals to enable that to happen. And that retail financing has to be at a subsidized level. Because you can't have a bond issuance for this. You can't have a, channeling from GCF, G2G channeling of finance to this. So this is an example of a bottom-up kind of financing, retail kind of financing, which we need to look at. But we also need to look at other instruments which are top-down. Like, for example, can we set up adaptation bonds? Or can we look at credit guarantees, right? We also already have a successful example of credit guarantees in the central government CGTMSC, right? So can we extend that to climate and specifically to adaptation? Concessional lending, concessional financing. Guarantees are a huge part of concessional lending in India. When you look at the last 20 years, more than 50% of the blended financing instruments in India has been guarantees. When we look at expanding insurance coverage, especially parametric insurance, again, one recent small scale example is SEVA has introduced a parametric insurance for its members, where, it is related to heat as a parameter. So when they miss work because of extremely high temperature, then a payout automatically happens, right?
Who has introduced?
SEVA. So can we look at institutionalizing and scaling it up? I mean,
at a community scale or something.
Their members, around 30,000 members are there. But can we institutionalize and scale it up, right? And while I'm giving these specific examples, I'm also looking at a wider global replicability of it, because of course the GBA is about the entire globe. And finally about, subsidies and so on, because as speakers mentioned before me, the private sector is not going to solve adaptation. We can, of course, it doesn't mean that we need to stop working with the private sector. We need to look at the niche solutions which they can offer in order to solve for adaptation. But it's a government's burden at the end of the day. And, that has to be recognized. There is also some concern about MDBs, right? And this, I think, the next COP can address. That one is, of course, the reforms in MDBs, but the other is also there are some MDBs and sovereign wealth funds like NIIF or IFC, which seem to be more focused on private rate of returns and less about the public good, right? IFC has almost become like you can say a private equity organization, or NIIF even for that matter. Right, so where is the public good here, and where is the adaptation funding there? Right, so this is something which again the next COP can have a look at. So that is one set of concerns. The other is about taxonomy. Of course, every country now, it is like almost every country and every bloc are coming up with their own taxonomy. Maybe there is some harmonization because setting up a taxonomy de novo is quite difficult. So maybe we are adopting something from the European Union, maybe we are including our own elements, but a taxonomy is absolutely essential for finance flows. Otherwise, nobody knows whether they are funding adaptation or funding mitigation or not. So, and also it is essential from an auditing perspective. You want to issue an adaptation bond tomorrow, Then the taxonomy says that this is adaptation. And then you do the audits so that you prove that the money is going towards adaptation. And then you need to have MEL as well, measurements, evaluations, and so on, to measure the kind of adaptation flows which are happening. The government should emphasize additionality. As I previously mentioned, any grey infrastructure project, most grey infrastructure projects can have an element of adaptation. It is difficult to measure, I agree, but there can be an element of adaptation, and that element of adaptation can be 5% or 10% of the project cost. But that can be a concessional project financing for these projects, right? So we can use a carrot and stick approach. Right now, the way grey infrastructure is being evaluated from an environmental perspective is that we have the environmental impact assessment. But can we introduce a mandatory climate action element to that, including adaptation? So that is the stick. The carrot can be that, okay, for that additional element of the project, we will give you concessional lending, right? The government or MDBs and so on, right? And that counts towards government's financing of adaptation, right? So can we do that? Can we emphasize that additionality? Of course, as I mentioned previously, financial instruments the number of financial instruments, the range of financial instruments has to grow, and it has to be driven both from the governments, the MDBs, but also from private financial institutions and so on. And yeah, so those are my thoughts on financing adaptation. So over to you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Krishnan, for this very insightful and extensive presentation on financing aspects of adaptation financing. Now I come to give the floor to Shashikant Chopde. Mr. Chopde, you have the floor.
Thank you for the opportunity. Today I'm pleasantly reminded, 2005, when Ruchi and I, along with other colleagues, were developing a adaptation project. It was climate resilient development and adaptation. And Dr. Rajshri Ray was also, the anchor person from there. And sir, you were the secretary, I suppose, that time, 2005, if I'm not wrong. So we developed the project, full scale, the JEF project. Though, under like adaptation financing, it is a huge amount that will be required. But we selected some sites in the country, 2 flood sites, 2 drought sites, and 2 cyclone sites, coastal sites. Tried developing, and then we had a lot of debate, what should be considered as additionality, with you also, ma'am, that time. So it was challenging still, challenging that time also, and today also after 18 years. Still, struggling with, nomenclature, taxonomy, yeah, these words. Yesterday, after, getting confirmation that the meeting is happening, I was just reflecting on, okay, what is adaptation? Oh, it's a governance issue, yes. It's an equity issue, yes. Is it a poverty issue? Yes. It's also multi-sectoral, across sectors. And it's also multiple approaches integration. You're talking about adaptation, building adaptive capacity, talking about building resilience, building infrastructure resilience. So there are multiple approaches, and there are established approaches in all this that we'll need to consider together when we're talking about promoting adaptation. So the lines between, you were talking about lines getting blurred between adaptation and mitigation. I would add to that list. The boundaries are getting blurred between poverty and vulnerability, between development and adaptation. And there are, so it's quite a messy thing. It's quite a complex animal. So now I'll focus more on, the way forward part of it. Stock take, that's been discussed, but way forward from moving from here to the next COP. And on, some light on the indicators and the modus of financing. In India, as you all know, we have NABARD for financing adaptation projects. And as you rightly said, there is a bias. Not all sectors, because it's a niche area, agriculture, rural development, is a niche area of NABARD. there's a bias to promoting adaptation in the country. So urban areas, for example, if you put a project on urban adaptation, whether, how long it will take to fructify through NABARD financing. Apart from that, there are this various missions, and we need to see how much of the budget allocation across, various missions and utilization across missions. So there are issues over there. But we have a very good example of implementation of, where actually, which can be used as a model for promoting adaptation. We have this wonderful aspirational district program, where various programs, various, department ministries programs converge at the grassroots level. And given the adaptation, we are talking about, it has to be area-based, intersectoral. So that kind of approach would be needed when you're talking about promoting adaptation in the country. On the targets, again, I was, thinking about, is it a health issue? Yes. Is it a food security issue? Yes. Is it a water security issue? Yes. So when I prepared a long list, and then mapped with SDG, almost it was, full mapping. So all the 17, SDG 17, if you just subtract the two, the climate 13 one, and the 11th one, habitats, all the indicators that are used for SDG can be actually considered as an outcome of adaptation interventions. But in case of adaptation, the impacts are long felt. The climate impacts. We have immediate impacts of extreme events, for example, flooding or drought. Immediate impacts, loss of crops, but also associated secondary and long-term impacts. And the response, any adaptation response that you promote, implement, has a lag time. It doesn't give benefits immediately. So you don't see the effects on livelihoods or development immediately of the adaptation projects. So the indicators, for me, the indicators could be related to the SDG indicators, but there needs to be a mechanism for climate screening of various projects, various development initiatives. There was a standing committee on finance which actually had prepared a template for screening projects for financing, but that needs to be again revived, and we need to have approach to climate screening all the development projects. And as various agencies do, like World Bank and all, they have markup some amount. Like if a project is costing X billion, then 2% or 3% or 1.5%, depending on the sector and the complexity involved. So these values need to be established properly through thorough research. What is the additionality or additional finance that will be required? And based on that, whatever, as you rightly said, Dr. Rashmi, it has to be driven primarily by domestic funding for India. So it has to be mainstreamed in whatever we do. So adaptation is basically, as you know, it's a right kind of development we are talking about. Informed development, climate risk informed development. So primarily, we can work out details of indicators and methods and approaches to assess adaptation needs, and then go ahead with financing. Financing is a big question, definitely. We are still stuck. $100 billion never came for last 5 years, no, from 2020. Now we are again renaming that fund as NCQG, something like that, collective, and then trying about doubling the finance. So that financing issue will be there, but India can't afford to, India has to take strides, and also being a leader now, established leader, we need to actually demonstrate how things can move ahead by developing indicators and innovative financing mechanisms. Yes, insurance is there. We have good knowledge on infrastructure resilience, CDRI, the College for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure is housed here. So we have all the apparatus, all the systems in place. We have SAPCCs, state disaster management plans, district disaster management plans in place. But we are, because these plans are not linked to financing, these plans seldom get implemented fully. So we need to find mechanisms where actually and I'll say we need to mainstream adaptation into development, right? Which has to be climate risk informed through developing indicators and doing a risk screening mechanism for all the development projects in the country.
Thank you, Mr. Chopte, for discussing the complexity of adaptation interventions, and in particular for highlighting the correspondence between adaptation and development. So now I give the floor to Suruchi. So Suruchi, you have the floor.
Thank you, sir. I think I would like to begin by saying that I echo a lot of the thoughts that have been shared by my previous speakers. And I look at the Glasgow Sharm el-Sheikh work program on global goal and adaptation as a welcome step of actually acknowledging adaptation. I agree with the previous speakers and you, sir, when you basically mentioned that adaptation has received a stepchild treatment in the global negotiating process. And for obvious reasons that Harjeet said, maybe initially our focus was much more on reducing the concentrations of greenhouse gases to a level that possibly adaptation would not be required to be a topic of discussion today. And that, since that did not happen, and we failed in our efforts with regards to limiting ourselves, with regards to the overall emissions that we have and the concentrations levels that we have now in the atmosphere, is the need that we are, now feeling that we will have to focus on adaptation and have a much stronger agenda that we thought about maybe 2 to 3 decades back that we needed to be discussing this topic. Of course, I also relate to the point made by you that, you cannot look at adaptation in isolation with mitigation. There is a strong connect, and the more efforts that we put on the mitigation side, of course, the lesser requirements for adaptation and the loss and damage that will be felt, and the finance requirements for it accordingly. Therefore, we do need to look at them together. Whenever we talk about adaptation, we should be talking about mitigation. And when we talk about mitigation, we should be talking about the implications on the adaptation side. There is a connect, and there are two sides of the same coin. And that's how I see them actually moving together. What I acknowledge in the negotiating process is that for the first time in the text, while I was reading it, they have realized that adaptation is a global challenge for all. I'm emphasizing on the word global challenge because till today, I have been hearing adaptation is locally construed. It's the problem of countries and how they basically address the concerns related to these risks, which is basically likely to happen at scales which are much more local and national and regionally centered. I think we haven't heard people say it's a global challenge. It is a global challenge. It is linked with the mitigation issue. And we need to have global solutions for the local issues that we've created. And that acknowledgement in the text, I think, is a welcome step that I see, that at least they've mentioned it's a global challenge. And therefore, if it's a global challenge, what are those global solutions that we can talk about to be able to address adaptation? Unfortunately, the text, if you go through it, again goes back on the older ways of looking at things and, of saying that while it is a global challenge, the solutions will have to be looked at the national, subnational, local scales, etc. But, I still would feel when we were talking about the global goal on adaptation, we should have been far more ambitious with regards to what we were stating. We should have been able to say, what are the global challenges that we see because of climate change, for which adaptation, global goals have to be set up for adaptation. Are we talking about global food security being affected? We're talking about water security being affected, or global health security as a concern. And for those, what are the parameters, indicators that need to be developed with regards to which we can basically measure, the risks that basically, can be reduced. What are the progress indicators that we can look at with regards to those concerns? And globally, can we talk about a secure world that basically has a much lesser impact than that we foresee with regards to the changes that we are talking about in the climate. So I'm talking about a level up with regards to the indicators and the metrics that need to be defined at a global scale, which of course then relates at the national level, the regional level, etc., with regards to different, indicators that can be defined. I agree with Shashi with regards to one of the ways to do it. And I think I was hearing Dr. Anand Patwardhan and I were having a discussion on the global goal and adaptation, the COP. We just met on the sides and we were just discussing. I think one of the things that the people who were discussing the GGA there and negotiating the text there felt was, we do not need another set of goals to be developed when we have already so many goals defined out there. And I agree on that particular part, because there's a strong overlap of what we are talking about is needed in adaptation with the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. And but we have not basically looked at how they map with each other. And there's a need to see where the synergies can be drawn. And if they're already global goals that are defined on the sustainable development side, we need to see how do they map with the global goals on adaptation, what elements are there, that are inherent, where are the gaps, and what more is needed to be added to that agenda to be able to define the global goal on adaptation with much more clarity than they are today. So I think those are the challenges I see in the way forward that needs to be very clearly brought out. Have the global goals defined very clearly, maybe with synergies with the sustainable development goals, and for up till 2030s and then beyond with regards to the long-term agenda setting that we need for adaptation, because it's just not going to end with 2030s. We do see that we are locked into climate change, and therefore over the next many decades, at least till 2080, 2090s, or 2100, we will need a clear agenda with regards to how we are defining our different metrics for adaptation and measurements of it and in the progress for it over this time, overlapping the mitigation agenda. I also feel very strongly that, the need for finance to be able to meet, these agendas, while global commitments can be made, we do need to find multiple ways of supporting the various activities. Of course, I agree that the private sector is not going to be interested until unless there's a business case for them and it to be able to, get involved and engaged. But there is a business case. And that story has not been told to the private sector, or maybe they don't understand it better because they're not looking at their value chains. They are not looking at the utilities and how that may get affected, and that may indirectly affect their own businesses. So there is an opportunity clearly for the private sector to engage, and I think we need to basically see how that can be done much more effectively to have them on board to support the adaptation agenda as well. Because by supporting the adaptation agenda, it's not that they're supporting somebody else, but they're going to end up supporting their own selves. So that kind of a business case that needs to be developed to push up the finances and the support for adaptation will be needed. And I very strongly feel, and that's something that possibly we need to work towards. What I do find in the negotiating text a little unfortunate is that a lot of it in between the lines basically mentions that while there is a global goal on adaptation, a lot of it with regards to what needs to be done is left to countries to sort out at their own levels. So it becomes again a national issue, and how you basically are able to address it effectively, whether you're able to find the finances for it, you are able to find the means of implementation, build your capacities, institutional capacities to be able to address those issues, etc. So the buck stops at the country level. It's your responsibility to be able to sort yourselves out with regards to, the risks that you basically face. And that's not the case, because we're saying it's a global challenge, it's a global issue. And somewhere that global connect cannot be lost. Of course, we have to basically address the concerns at the national level, the local level, but we need to see what linkages we can draw across the different levels to be able to get the right kind of support to leverage and strengthen the case for adaptation. And that possibly I see is not very strongly worded in the text with regards to how we can take it forward. And I do hope the next 2 years, when the contours are going to be fleshed out, these are the elements that are discussed and brought out very strongly with regards to looking at these linkages from the global to the local, the national, the local levels, and what kind of supports can be garnered, and also with regards to the engagement of different stakeholders and the contributions to support adaptation. And I'll just leave it there.
Thank you, Suruchi. And you have gone to considerable lengths to explain why and how the global goal on adaptation is in fact a global challenge, and not simply a collection of local challenges. And I think it is important to understand these are both local and global challenges. But how do we delineate what are the components of this broader challenge which are global in nature? Clearly, finance would be a global responsibility. Which are the local challenges? For example, impacts on ecosystems. But then say, for example, if we are evaluating the impacts on ecosystems or water resources, what are the risk criteria and methodologies which would be needed to evaluate the risk and therefore the scope and need for global financing? So there is a lot of work to be done. It's not at all easy. Now, you also mentioned about the opportunities for the private sector. I think it's a story not told sufficiently, not explained to the private sector sufficiently. And I think it is something that work needs to be done because clearly the question of adaptation will not be solved simply by recourse to public finance. The risks of all countries are stressed, and not very much more can really be raised public finance for adaptation. Now here I would like to go back to work that Rajshri did, I think in 2003, 2004.
2007, sir.
2007, okay. In which he mapped the development programs that we have in this country, the plan schemes, and how they relate to adaptation. And she was able to show that what the central government spends on adaptation, of course, it is completely synergistic with development, as Mr. Shokti had said, but that it actually exceeds our defense expenditure. Now, can you imagine? It's such a mind-boggling, revelation. And of course, we use these results to great effect when it came to the question of, negotiations and adaptation, and about, the question of, raising of resources, and, how India was in the forefront of addressing adaptation. How effective has India been in the question of adaptation? You see, I've been around for a very long time. And I know that if I take my mind back to the newspapers of 1950s and 60s, the annual deaths from drought and floods ran in the millions. And how much are they now? You know, they are, you know, we may have malnutrition, we may have people displaced, but we don't have people getting killed. I remember that the Odisha Andhra coast, there was a cyclone in the 60s. A single event killed more than 1 billion people. I think a few years ago, I think just 2 years ago, we had a similar cyclone in the Odisha Andhra coast. How many people did that kill? It killed about 20 people, of which 15 had come out to watch the show. So, and trees fell on them and, you know, sort of flying debris fell on them. But the point is that, yes, this money has been spent very effectively. India has built up its capacities, and India has actually learned many lessons along the way, both by way of resource allocations and by way of governance and implementation models to be able to address adaptation. Now, final word is that indeed adaptation is the ultimate development issue. We talk, for example, in terms of sea level rise and say that Bangladesh is one of the most vulnerable countries to sea level rise, and that, you know, it would lead to displacement of millions and millions of people. But we must note at the same time that Netherlands is a country which is even more vulnerable to sea level rise than Bangladesh is. But nobody speaks in terms of displacement or in terms of you know, distress for, you know, for people in the Netherlands. And that is, this only reflects the difference in levels of development between Netherlands and Bangladesh. If by 2050 Bangladesh had today's levels of per capita GDP as Netherlands, there would be no issue about how to handle the sea level rise. So I think I'm very glad that many of the speakers have brought out this, you know, very deep synergy between development and adaptation, and that, you know, adaptation really is smart development. So we'll close the session at this point, and Manish, over to you.
Thank you, sir. I think we are almost at time, so we've been very efficient. Thank you all the panelists for that. Yeah. So, but we have few people online also, and maybe we can share 5-10 minutes if there are any questions from the house or online. Those who are online, you may type your questions using the chat option. In the meanwhile, if there is any question, observation, comments from the room, please be brief and.
So I just had a comment, sir, on the terminologies that Rajshri had brought up in the document that is there in the negotiating text. Adaptation adequacy, adaptation effectiveness, you know, and that brings in the discussion on the incremental and the additionality part of adaptation to development, because we are not talking about business as usual development, but we are talking about addressing the risks, because BAU development may also fail under the risks that we are talking about. So therefore, the additionality and the incrementality component of adaptation that we're talking about with regards to the measures becomes all the more important. That part, so they have words over there, but nobody knows how to measure them. Nobody has done those kind of assessments. The gaps exist with regards to understanding how to basically measure adequacy. What is adequate adaptation? How do we define that? And once we do some kind of adaptation, you know, how much is enough and effective, you know, and is serving the need of reducing the risk to the context that we're talking about, whether floods or heat or any other, you know, the cyclones that you basically talked about. So that those kind of impact assessment studies, effectiveness, adequacy needs, etc., have not been done. And so a whole lot of gap, you know, still exists with regards to understanding all those things, carrying out those assessments, building our, you know, our base with regards to what needs to be done, so that we have a more resilient and secure future that we look for, in the world. So I think that's where I do want, if there are questions and a discussion around in terms of how do you see this further developing, and how do you think we should be considering this in the way forward or the agenda forward with regards to our thinking on adaptation.
I think Harijit wanted to say something, but while you make your point, there is also a question asking about, where do we situate waste management in this process? If you could also reflect, or
I wanted to make a separate point, but just to briefly add to what Suruchi said. So there's no doubt adaptation is about good development, and what you said, Suruchi. I think factor where we may need to differentiate between what Netherlands was able to do with the resources and what Bangladesh may be able to do is the increasing complexity of risks, which is also cascading. And as IPCC used that language, is true. And the dependence, as you were also mentioning, Dr. Ghosh, on mitigation. If emissions continue to rise, temperatures continue to rise, and I've spoken to people in Netherlands, they're really nervous now. They're saying even their technology is going to fail. So that when they did it, it was constant. Risks were constant, but not escalating the way they have in the last few years. I think that has to be taken into account in addition to what you said. I wanted to make a point on the whole fossil fuel, Ritu and Rajshri, what you were mentioning, and Mr. Rashmi. I think we need to very seriously reflect upon what COP has been able to deliver so far on the issue of fossil fuels, and will actually it be able to deliver, because it's so superficial despite being historic. I call it historic yet flawed, because at least at the first time we've started talking about it, but it's so superficial. We need to understand how complex it is in terms of countries' dependence on fossil fuels, in terms of energy, when we say in case of India, of course, employment, but not revenues as much as it is in case of Colombia and Nigeria. And when you put a lens of per capita income, then you have to differentiate between Timor-Leste and Nigeria and Canada and the US, and US is the biggest fossil fuel producer now. And we don't even call it a petro state, right? Everybody looks at UAE as a petro state, but the fact is it's the US. So how do you understand the whole issue of fossil fuel from that complexity? And then how do you look at the issue of just transition? I know because of the terminology, things have become very sensitive in India, but the reality is a coal miner cannot become a solar engineer, at least in his or her lifetime. So what does that just transition mean? Gujarat is going to gain, Tamil Nadu is going to gain, Jharkhand is going to lose. Odisha is going to lose. So how are we looking at it in our own context, but also then globally? And it is a real issue. COP cannot deliver that, because you're meeting twice a year, and then with such political complexity and dynamics, we will not be able to deal with it. So which means we are missing that framework which actually can help operationalize equity. We got this term of equity, order, equitable, orderly, and just transition, but what that actually means. And then you have on the other side such hypocritical situation when majority of the fossil fuel expansion is happening by 5 countries, more than 50% globally. If you look at Australia, Canada, Norway, US, UK, and they are the ones who portray themselves as climate champions. So what we do round the year to actually call out their hypocrisy and put pressure on them, now that we have got something at COP28 in terms of all fossil fuels and not just cornering countries like India or Indonesia and China on coal. So it is historic, yet it is insufficient. And that's why, some people were asking about, Suchi, you were asking about my shift, and that's why we are calling for a complementary global framework in the form of a treaty or whatever way it comes up. The point is not that. We are missing that framework, which has to look into this issue in a very comprehensive manner. It's about jobs, it's about revenues. Nigeria needs a lot more support than Canada. Canada should just stop it, but it's not. So I think we need to look at that issue going forward in a much more deeper manner.
I think there was a question on waste and its relationship to adaptation. So would any of the panelists try to respond to this? Well, if not,
I think,
please go ahead.
I mean, a tangential point to the Netherlands and Bangladesh example which you gave. Netherlands has something called water boards. They have been around for centuries and people are elected to it. So they have been since the age when, half of Netherlands did not exist in the 12th century. Slowly they started recovering and building those dams and recovering land. So they have been managing that and managing the risks associated with it. So it's not only a question of resources, it's also a question of people being aware, the governments being aware and working towards it. So I think it can be applied more broadly to adaptation, mitigation, climate action as well. So anyways, that was a tangential point I wanted to make. But about waste management, I think, yes, I mean, it is important because, we are becoming richer. A lot of developing economies are growing richer. And the amount of waste is exploding. So definitely there has to be a focus on circularity, right? The second is, of course, streamlining and, RRR, recycling, reuse, and so on. Governments have to mandate that, citizens have to, follow that. And thirdly, reuse of waste, which is where, the adaptation or the financing aspect of that comes into the picture, right? So there are very many ways to reuse the waste or even avoid the waste. And of course, that needs to be financed. We have done waste to energy, not extremely successful, but there are some isolated examples which have been good. And, countries like, for example, Korea, etc., they have worked out ways to make the entire thing circular or make historical dump sites into parks, for example, right? So, yeah, I mean, there are a lot of examples around, and indeed, waste management is a part of adaptation. And it's something which is growing more and more important for India. Yeah.
Let me just add to that. The point is that waste, if it is let out into the environment, has clear impacts, firstly on health, and secondly on ecosystem sustainability. And by addressing waste through the 3 R's, as Mr. Krishnan had said, what we do is that we address the mitigation side, because extraction of the virgin materials, from nature involves a great deal of GHGs, whereas recycling and reuse has a much smaller GHG impact. And secondly, of course, is that the less you seek to extract virgin materials from nature, the less of the impact that you're making on ecosystems. So yes, there are very deep connections between waste management and adaptation as well as on mitigation. Anyone have a question?
Yeah, there are 2 more questions. One is about India's...
India is a beneficiary or a contributor to the loss and damage fund.
I can take that question. Yeah. So the response is as follows. Whether it is loss and damage fund or any other fund for that matter, adaptation fund or green climate fund, there follows a principle there in terms of contribution of climate finance. So this is under a multilateral treaty, and there is an obligation, responsibility based on the historical responsibility. So obligation of contribution of climate finance to specific funds rests with the developed countries. So that is the principle which we are following now, and that is the principle which we would be following. I can say that at least in the near future. For many years to come. So we would, I don't see at this point in time that we are going to be a contributor to the loss and damage fund. And as far as the beneficiary is concerned, eligibility criteria of the loss and damage governing instrument clearly indicates all developing countries. So that is the response for that. And maybe I can take the last one also very quickly. As NAPCC and SAPCC, of course, these are there in the public domain. So we do have National Action Plan on Climate Change. Under that, national mission. So the last one which has been included is the health mission, and the other one on transport and coastal mission, that is work in progress now. So 9 national missions are there, and regarding the state action plans on climate change, 34 states and duties, they have prepared their state action plans on climate change. And one must understand that these are not static documents. These are dynamic documents depending on the kind, especially on the other developments, including the COP decisions and all. We have to kind of revisit it in the light of those developments. And Executive Council on Climate Change, under the PM Council on Climate Change, regularly meets and takes stock of how we are going ahead with the national missions and various other developments. Thank you.
Thank you, Rashi. Any other question?
Thank you, Rajesh. Let me take this opportunity to once again extend thanks and gratitude for all the panelists to come come physically in the age of virtual preferences. Dr. Ghosh, who has driven all the way from Gurgaon. And of course, Dr. Dhawan and Mr. Rashmi for their constant guidance and encouragement. We also would like to specifically mention that this workshop, this event was facilitated or organized under the grant that we have from Bloomberg Philanthropy. Ankit Jha is online, has been listening on. So thank you, Ankit, for the support. In addition, and I think most importantly, Pooja Sehwag here, who has been coordinating, she is due for her PhD submission this week, and still she was coordinating for that event. I just hope that she doesn't get carried away after this discussion and decides to write an epilogue to her thesis on CBDR in the light of latest COP. But all the best wishes to you, Pooja, for your submission. Ashmita here was helping her. On the logistics side, we have a long list of people: Valsaji, Mukesh, Ritu, Varun, Sumit is here, Rajiv Sharma for designing the banner, Kabindra and Janu for help in IT, and of course, many more. So thank you, everybody. And with your permission, the chairs and Dr. Dhawan, I would like to invite all of you for lunch. Lunch will be warm. I cannot guarantee that the space on the 5th floor would be warm. For that, we'll have to rely on the graces of nature. So thank you once again, and you're all invited to join for lunch upstairs on 5th floor.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. That was great.